This is going to be a weird video. Let's get it started. On May 2019, Jacob Geller releases the video, Who's Afraid of Modern Art? Vandalism, Video Games, and Fascism. We're not going to cover this video. Instead, we're covering a video that came out just a month after. It's called Modern Art and the Decline of Civilization. This is by Academy of Ideas. That video is obviously going to be critical of modern art. Jacob Geller's video, on the other hand, is a defender of it and covers art pieces that either look overly simple, like Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, to that of the putrid, like Piss Christ. In your mind, then, you may have a picture of what kind of modern art Academy Ideas is being critical of. It's not that kind of art. It's about the classics. This video is going to be in some ways very similar to Jacob's video. However, the main difference is that we're going to be more concise, as we'll be mainly discussing Academy of Ideas video. If we step back here, Jacob's video can be broadly described as pointing out the similarities between conservatives and Nazis and their views on art. In this video, I'm really not going to be doing that with Academy Ideas. I'm not going to be suggesting that his views are similar to that of the Nazis. In fact, I'm not much of a fan of the association that he makes. Bad art criticism should hold up on its own. It's like if I have an issue with plagiarism. You can easily critique someone for plagiarizing another person's work without having to bring up the Nazis. So for this video, I'm not really going to be saying that Academy Ideas video is similar to that of Nazis, because I really don't have to. Before we get into the video itself, I want to hash out a few things first. First of all, Academy of Ideas is going to be referred to as AOI. Second of all, there may be some confusion in the video because of AOI's usage of the term modern art. You may believe that modern art only refers to, well, modern art, but it is acceptable to use the term in referring to exclusively art that comes from the mid-1800s to the late 1900s. The weirdness already starts as AOI never gets past the year 1942 for some reason. Another major problem that will become very obvious pretty soon is that AOI is heavily into pretentiously deep-sounding quotes. This is a trend that follows throughout all of his videos. Deep-sounding quotes almost always have the issue of either being misconstrued or cherry-picked. This can be done in a number of ways, from removing it from context. It usually leaves the issue of the viewer having to assume a number of things, or the failure to point out that a statement isn't a factual one, but that of an opinion. Again, if you know me, I very much like the context behind statements, the what, the when, the where, and the why. We can apply this to even the most narrow of circumstances. For example, words. What a word means, let's say a Russian author from the 1900s, is likely going to differ from how you view that word. Now, this video isn't going to touch on everything in AOI's video. That's because most of it makes vague remarks on modern art. What I want to do is focus on the specifics, as in paintings, artists, or genres themselves. So when we're going to start focusing on details in this video, that's when things are going to get unusual. Finally, I understand that this video is about art, and art is subjective, so it feels like this critique would be pointless, because most of the things that AOI is talking about are subjective. That thought is going to be proven wrong with some discussion on Edward keep watching and Friedrich Caspar.
The chaos which modern artists suffered and expressed through their art assumed various forms in the works of 19th century painters. In its subtlest and most aesthetically pleasing form, it can be seen in the masterpieces of Caspar David Friedrich and Edvard Munch. Through their works, both these artists gave visual representation to the ethos of desolation which was spreading across Europe at the time.
Ethos of desolation. Now that's an interesting phrase. A phrase that sounds deep, but is clearly one of a more pretentious nature, as AOI doesn't really go into what ethos of desolation definitively means. However, let's focus on his language regarding Friedrich's work.
In Friedrich's paintings, the setting for this ethos of desolation is nature. His landscapes portray a world grown cold, in which Mother Earth elicits the feelings of dread associated with being alone and homeless in the midst of its vast empty spaces.
This is a strange statement to make, at least if we were to consider the art he was making during the same period. If we were to assume that Friedrich's work was representing this ethos of desolation, then we should expect all of his art during that same time to be similar. So I'm going to use the art that he shows when referring to the ethos of desolation as the time frame. So about 1809 to 1825. We can start to see immediately a problem with this type of language. From one year, he would paint something of rainbows, and within the same year, something of darkness. He had range. He had the ability to paint scenes of hope, of family, of awe, just as he had the ability to paint scenes of despair and the melancholic. AOI doesn't show any of these paintings. There's of course another consideration that we have to make. Is he actually understanding the paintings that he's showing on screen? Again, of course, art is subjective, yet I feel as if there is certain facts that are being left out to the audience. Let's consider, for example, this painting that AOI shows. AOI's bleak paintings from Friedrich always have the note of winter to them, which shouldn't be surprising as this is the season where nature starts to die and recede due to the cold. So of course there's going to be a more somber mood to it. However, one important piece of information that should be clued into the audience that isn't, is that this isn't winter. It's spring. We know it's set during this time as the name of the painting was Northern Landscape. Spring. This is an interesting detail from Friedrich, as it lets us know that this cold landscape should soon start to spring life. However, there's something unusual with this statement. You would think that somewhere in this painting there should be something to represent this, but we really don't see anything like that. There is, but AOI here isn't using the full picture, well, full painting here, as he has cropped out the rest of the painting. Even then, he's not even using a cleaner version of this painting, as we see that this painting doesn't have the best lighting quality to it. So let's swap it out with a cleaner version. It can be quite difficult to see this hint at a glance. However, the trick is not to look at the distance, but what is closest to the viewer. And what we see is simply grass. It's a small part of the painting, but it was intended to be there. In this vast cold landscape, we see two figures. He could have chosen to paint only one figure, but he didn't. He painted two. He could have chosen to have the painting be more gloomy by being it at night, but he didn't. He chose the painting to be at early day. It can't be an ethos of desolation. It can't be a world grown cold. The painting is ultimately hopeful. The painting before this makes much more sense within regards to these types of terms. It's called Winter Landscape. We see it's night. A single man, hobbled over crutches, stands out in the cold, surrounded by death. It's acceptable to view this painting as grim, as AOI paints. There is one context problem. This painting is considered to have a companion piece to it, of the same name. Here we see the same man, but with his crutches cast aside, and we see him praying to God. The darkness we see before has started to fade. In the short distance in the light, we see a grand church. We see an interesting mirror effect with both the church in the distance and the fir tree behind the cross. Lastly, one small interesting detail we can see is grass peeking through the snow. Alone, one may be considered to be very hopeful and the other grim, but together it's the classic death and rebirth trope. I mean, come on, it's Jesus Christ. Dying and coming back, it's his classic thing. Well, a lot of Christianity does something similar, but you get the idea. Friedrich was a very religious man, and it's not surprising to see a lot of religious themes in a lot of his paintings. What AOI is trying to do here is to establish and build a narrative. With a narrative, there has to be a removal of complexities, context, and caveats. However, without those considerations, it's obvious the narrative is flawed. There's always the question, is this person approaching the subject in good faith? And I always try to assume so unless there's evidence to suggest otherwise. So is AOI approaching Friedrich and art in general in good faith? Well, not really. All of this art, and as we're going to see later on with quotes, he uses are more so secondary to the narrative that he's trying to build. He never really discusses or examines a single painting in this entire video. Well, there is one exception to this.
In 1810, the German poet Heinrich von Kleist described Caspar's painting, The Wreck of Hope, in the following manner. The solitary spark of life in the boundless kingdom of death, the lonely center point in the region of loneliness, This picture with its 2 or 3 mysterious objects opens out before us like the apocalypse itself.
This single quote is the reason I made this video. It's unclear what the solitary spark of life is in reference to. The painting itself doesn't show anyone alive, and what is the 2 or 3 mysterious objects? When we look into the painting itself, we do see more of this unusual distortion. Heinrich wasn't discussing this painting. In fact, I doubt he ever laid eyes upon it. That's because this was painted in the 1820s. The original comment was made in around 1810, and von Kleist himself died in 1811. So he's been dead for a while now. So if he was dead before this was painted, what painting was he referring to? Well, if you're relying on the quote that AOI provides, it's going to be quite difficult to find what Heinrich was referring to. However, if we weren't and we were to simply type in the poet's name and the artist's name, we can find what the painting the quote was in reference to. The painting was Monk by the Sea, not Shipwreck of Hope. The only question we now have is, how does this mistake happen? It's a weird mistake, mainly because it's a difficult and unique mistake to make. I could partly accept possibly Abbey and the Oakwood, same period, and they were shown commonly together. That's an easier mistake. This is the only quote in his entire video that comments on a piece of art, and it manages to get it wrong. Like all mistakes, they can be useful to you, as you can learn from them. And what we learned from AOI's mistake is that it's likely that AOI never read Heinrich's full quote, or even knew what it was in reference to. So if AOI never read the full quote in its full context, how did he get it? Well, it's likely that he just pulled it from another source, which also didn't use it correctly or gave full context. This, however, shows that the quotes and the images that he's using are much more secondary to the narrative that he's trying to build. As if he cared a little bit to check on the images or quotes that he uses, he would have found that mistake. We see this trend continue on as when AOI is talking about Monk, we run into the similar theme of him finding negative imagery and then forcing these images into a narrow perception. This is especially reinforced as AOI provides no in-depth analysis into any of these paintings.
In the works of Edvard Munch, this ethos of desolation is transferred from nature to the social world. The subjects in Munch's paintings suffer from an unbearable isolation. They are lonely souls, unbridgeable islands unto themselves, unable, in their anxiety and sorrow, to reach out to, connect with, and find solace in others. Never, it seems to me, was man so molten and fluid, and yet never was he so shut up within himself, never so walled about as he is today, and never was he so cold of heart.
Both these paintings aren't solely about isolation. The main theme is relationships. It's not about them being unbridgeable souls unable to reach out to others. The first one is about heartbreak. Art is subjective, so why don't I explain how I got into this position, rather than just asserting that this painting must be this way, as AOI does. First of all, the first clue that this is about breakup is the name of the painting. It's called Separation. These two figures were once together, but have now separated. The emphasis in separation can also be seen in the differences between the two figures. The male is surrounded by darker colors and looks to be in great emotional pain and seems to be headed forward, but is stopped by plants. The woman is the opposite. Not only is she colored in lighter, happier colors, she is faced in the opposite direction, looking towards the sea. We could assume that this represents that the breakup of the relationship wasn't inherently negative for both sides, but for me, I view it as the male is stuck in the past, reminiscing on what once was. The woman on the right seems to be wispy and blurry, seeming to represent an old cherished memory of her. Take note about the man's hand, which is clutched over his chest. It seems to have similar colors to the plant that blocks his own path. This plant looks very similar to that of a heart. Then notice how the palette of the man's hand is actually quite dissimilar to the man's own face, yet the palette would seem more in line with the woman's. The man is both literally and metaphorically stopped by his heart over a past love. It's not about people being unbearable islands. It's about a relationship that has shattered, and a man being unable to move forward from it. The next painting is Melancholy, and while it does look sad, it's a bit more complex than AOI lets on. AOI is again looking for sad paintings, but not understanding the complexities in those paintings. Take, for example, the background. We see three people. To the left, we see a crossed figure. This is likely the oarman for the boat. And then to the right, we see a man and a woman. The whole scene seems to me as the couple is having a romantic outing, and yet the person in the front is melancholic. This painting has multiple versions of itself. And with those multiple versions, we have also had multiple names attached to it. With those multiple names, we can get another clue into what's happening in this painting. Jealousy. This clues us in that this isn't symbolic of him being sad over a past relationship, but melancholic or jealous of what we see in the distance. If we take the historical context, we can figure out that this inspiration for this painting was based on one of Munch's friends. This friend was involved with a love affair with a married woman, and as you could guess, that did not go well. The final painting? Yeah, it looks sad, but AOI chose all of these paintings because they look sad. This focus on the negative comes in through two ways: choosing only negative paintings, rather than trying to understand the whole of an author's work, and then understanding only through a negative lens. We see this not only in the paintings, but also in the quotes he decides to use.
But the chaos of 19th century art pales in comparison with its manifestations in the first half of the 20th century. As modern art progressed, the chaos menacing it only became more explicit and pronounced. In Picasso's paintings, for example, the human being is broken into fragmented parts, and then pieced together again in disjointed, abstract, and often hideous forms. Picasso's art no longer seeks the complete human being at all, wrote Nikolai Berdyaev. It has lost the faculty of seeing things as wholes. It tears off one cover after another in order to lay bare the structure of nature, and in doing so, penetrates even further into the depths, disclosing images of things truly monstrous.
The quotes he chooses have an obvious bias against Picasso's art. There's no attempt to explain the art shown. However, let's consider the quote for when it came out. It comes from Meaning of History, and that was published in 1923. I would want to tell you first that Picasso has an incredible range. That's because, well, consider that this image also came out in 1923. While this image came out in 1905, it would make it seem that Picasso has lost his ability to see the whole human being. This would be a reasonable interpretation if I hadn't in fact just lied to you just now. Both paintings come from the same year. So for Nikolai, 1923 was probably a bad year to publish this statement. Of course, we could consider this criticism to be a bit unfair. It's unlikely that Nikolai was aware of any of these paintings when his book was published in 1923. But there's a layer of recognizable irony here, as the claim that Picasso's art no longer seeks the complete human being at all is a strong statement to make. Yet if we were to look at the same year, we see that's not true at all. We can do a better critique of this. 6 years prior to Nikolai's publication, Picasso starts getting into a new art style that would last till 1927. So Nikolai writing his book would definitely be in that same period where Picasso was experimenting with this style. The new style that he's getting into is neoclassical. So at the same time we're seeing him doing synthetic cubism and surrealist-like paintings, we're also seeing him painting stuff like this. Nikolai is making the statement to paint Picasso as someone who's mentally degraded and can't paint the whole human form. And yet, that's not true at all. Then again, let's remove Berdyaev from this consideration, and for a second consider AOI. AOI has a quote that comes from a book that's from nearly 100 years ago, and that quote could be hardly considered good criticism of Picasso's work. The only question that comes up now is, why cite the guy? there is surely better criticism of Picasso that has come out. There's another flaw that we should discuss when considering terms like fragmentation and the whole that AOI and Nicolai use. That is because Picasso was at the forefront of Cubism. Yet neither AOI nor Nicolai in either of their works tries to explain what a cubist is. If I were to give an explanation on what Cubism entails, it would make it very clear that AOI and Berdyaev are acting in bad faith. I'm not going to get into explaining what Cubism is just yet. That'll be when it's paired up when discussing Futurism later in the video. I only say this as AOI's video is going to shift from discussing artists to discussing whole genres of art, and I feel it's better to discuss it there. Take, for example, Surrealism.
In the movement of Surrealism, the chaotic is not only represented visually, but explicitly exalted as a principle of life. Salvador Dali declared painting to be the colored instantaneous photography of concrete irrationality and the systematization of confusion. André Breton, in his second manifesto, declared Surrealism to have attained a point of view from which life and death, the real and imagined, top and bottom, are no longer experienced as contradictory opposites.
There are some unusual, small, peculiar mistakes with the usage of these quotes. It's interesting to note again the translation style is unusual, making it really difficult to find the original sources for these quotes. But that's a whole other thing. When I say peculiar, that's because when we look at these small snippets in a broader context, we find that they differ from what AOI states in small amounts, but just enough that I question AOI's decisions to include them. For example, in the first bit, the first issue we have here is that both of these quotes come from different publications. You wouldn't know that, as AOI doesn't give citations for either of them. If we were to look at the first, one would see a really peculiar mistake. In the lack thereof, well, a huge section is cut out. Now, of course, this is a small issue that could be fixed by, well, just 3 dots. But if I were to give him that, I would question why he wouldn't use an earlier sentence in the essay, as it directly points to Dali's goal in painting pictures of concrete irrationality. But instead, he uses a quote that doesn't illustrate this point. That section of the essay is used to help partially describe what concrete irrationality is, but he removed 90% of it. Why the weirdness? Well, it's likely that AOI hasn't actually read the source. He certainly doesn't cite it, and there's a better quote here, but instead he takes from another section and misquotes it. I mean, take for example the systemization of confusion. That is 3 words. He gives Berdyaev a paragraph. He doesn't give Dali this. Given context, Dali doesn't claim that painting is the systemization of confusion. He just states that in the future it'll be possible to systemize confusion. When he brings up André Breton, we find that this whole shtick kind of repeats itself.
André Breton, in his second manifesto, declared Surrealism to have attained a point of view from which life and death, the real and imagined, top and bottom, are no longer experienced as contradictory opposites.
However, when we pull up that manifesto, we find they don't even claim to have attained that point of view. Rather, they believe that there's a point of mind, and that surrealists hope in finding and fixing that point. Why get these small things wrong? And, more importantly, why quote them in such small snippets? Well, again, the likelihood is that AOI hasn't read any of these quotes in their full context. AOI doesn't actually explain what surrealism is. He'll try to associate it with the love of chaos and a desire to annihilate the human form, but this language fails to give an accurate representation of any of the real themes that surrealism cares about, like dreams or the unconscious. Now, while I still think the quote he uses of André Breton was incorrectly used, the quote alone does helpfully portray what a lot of surrealists try to achieve. Find what seems to be contradictory ideas and put them into a single place. This isn't really chaos per se, it's mostly juxtaposition. Surrealism just tries to find the middle ground between opposites, the logical and the illogical, dreams and reality. This resolution, as André Breton put it, to be a kind of absolute reality, a surreality. A good example of them playing with contradictions is the treachery of images. This simple surrealist painting is just a pipe. However, underneath the pipe, the text says, "This is not a pipe." It's a simple contradiction, but a contradiction that's easy to resolve, as the image itself is, of course, not a pipe. With this idea, however, we can likely extend it to different scenarios. The word pipe is not a pipe. A memory of a pipe is not a pipe. And if you were to look at a pipe, is what you're seeing a pipe? The answer to the last one is a solid maybe. So if this image of a pipe is not a pipe, then the rest of these pipes are also not pipes. Not a single one of these are real pipes. All of this is fake. So the 3D space that we see here also doesn't exist. I am not moving, I am not recording this while taking all of these actions, but all the audio is edited in. Those walls, which are not walls, are also fake. They are green, not walls. While this may be the real Ubu here, the question is whether he's holding a fake pipe. I think not. As Ubu is the truest, true being there is, so the pipe he's holding also has to be real. Now onto Cubism and Futurism.
And entities which have no intrinsic connection to each other are brought together in a senseless embrace. This impulse to absorb the human into the inorganic can also be seen in the movements of Cubism and Futurism. The human becomes lost, a thing among things, dissolved in the surrounding world of inanimate objects. In Futurism, wrote Berdyaev, man has completely ceased to be the leading theme of art. Indeed, in futurist art there are literally no more human beings, for man has been torn into tatters. All the real things in the world leave the places that are proper to them, and objects such as lamps, sofas, streets begin to penetrate the human form, so that man and his incomparable personality are no longer entities at all. Man collapses into the world of objects.
There's one interesting thing to note about this video, especially in regard to this quote. In the entirety of his video, there isn't a single piece of art in it that's from a futurist. The pic he shows has futurist elements in it, but it was ultimately shown in a cubist art exhibit from an explicitly non-futurist. AOI also doesn't even describe what futurism or cubism is. So what is cubism? Well, that's difficult to say, but generally we see two themes. One, the breaking down of objects into simpler geometric shapes, and the idea of depicting things from multiple different perspectives. There are many beautiful cubist paintings that could help us show what cubism is, but I find one to be the most useful, and that is Metzinger's Tea Time. As we see, much of the character in the background is broken down into more of that geometric style. Now let me draw your eyes to the cup. This is the second theme we see in a lot of cubist works, the distortion in perspective. We can see both the front and above the cup at the same time. So how about Futurism? They are the opposite. They're aggressive. They're dynamic. They have focus in movement, in energy, in technology, and in war, but in a positive way. There are things you can critique Futurism with, one of them being that the Italian fascists were heavily involved with the movement, but besides that, the art itself was quite bombastic. You wouldn't really know any of that, as AOI just cites criticism against the art forms without explaining the art forms at all, and it kind of makes it feel hollow. Not only is the representation of the art forms poorly done, but there seems to be a lack of any art forms in general. Futurism and Cubism had many impacts in the developments of entirely new forms of art, like Orphism, Precisionism, Neoplastic, Constructivism, or something simple like Suprematism. But there seems to be a lacking of discussing in any of these. In fact, the newest painting that he shows is from 1942. He doesn't discuss newer developments of art within the 1900s. In fact, he doesn't really explain the art styles to begin with. This is a weird video. The only question now is why? This is going to be a weird video. Let's get it started. On May 2019, Jacob Geller releases the video, Who's Afraid of Modern Art? Vandalism, Video Games, and Fascism. We're not going to cover this video. Instead, we're covering a book that was published decades before, called Art in Crisis by Hans Seldmayr. Hans was a Nazi art professor, and the book reflects that, as it aims to represent a civilization in decline. It does this by representing modern art as a form of degeneration, a sickness, or literally the end. Hold on a second, I want to make one thing clear. I'm not doing what Jacob Geller did. I'm not doing that. I'm not suggesting that AOI's ideas are similar to Nazis' ideas, and I do that by bringing up some random Nazi art professor. I don't have to. I found Hans when I was researching AOI, and I kept coming back again and again to one of his books. Same unusual translations, similar cuts in those translations, same narrative, similar word use, and more importantly, the reason on why some of those mistakes happened. Most of AOI's video is built off of actual Nazi ideas. Okay, so let's actually prove this now. We run into the same type of language being repeated by both chaos, decline, sickness, and diagnosis. Narratively, in both the video and the book, they're heavily in the frame that society is experiencing a decline, and we can see this through art. We see the pinning of the start of the decline to the French Revolution. We have the same use of Spengler's ideas like the decline of civilization, yet at the end, a rejection of Spengler's full collapse with the discussion of renewal, same language. The unusual limitations on the art shown. To note, it should be unusual that AOI's art never makes it past the 1950s. This shouldn't be unusual though for Hans. To be clear, the oldest art piece that AOI shows is from 1942. So within the semantic phrase of modern art, AOI is unusually limited. This limitation isn't unusual for, say, Hans, but that's because his book was published in 1948. AOI's video was published in 2019, but follows the same limitations of Hans's book. Even then, all of this to me isn't really hard proof. However, ironically enough, it's his use of quotes that makes this whole thing obvious. Now, there are quotes that aren't really unusual for him, like Rollo or Jung, as he has had in previous videos discussing or using their works. It's these authors that most people haven't heard of that are the most suspect. About half of his quotes I consider to be ripped from Art in Crisis. This would seem like a difficult thing to conclude, but the translation styles are unique enough to such a degree that whenever you search for them, only two things pop up: Academy of Ideas and Art in Crisis. Now here's an interesting small mistake that AOI makes when citing Nikolai.
The picture of the ideal man disappeared from the 19th and 20th centuries, wrote Nikolai Berdyaev.
Now, of course, this is meaningless gobbledygook of a deep-sounding quote, as it's clear the author likely has a very narrow interpretation of what the ideal man is. However, this mistake I'm referring to isn't in the quote itself, but the reference. AOI cites the meaning of history as the source, but it doesn't come from that. Of course, the unusual translation makes it difficult to find the original, or even confirm it doesn't come from the source. However, as Hans only uses about 2 sources from Nikolai, it's not too difficult to find and eventually figure out where it exactly comes from. Hans is very much like AOI. He likes to throw deep-sounding quotes at the viewer, and if we pull up the location of the quote, we do see that the author does not cite where the quote is from. However, 2 pages down, the author does name drop the meaning of history along with the futurism and Picasso quote. It's easy to guess what happened here. AOI saw a citation a few pages down and assumed the quote prior came from the same source. Well, that was a mistake. Here's an interesting question. Does AOI's quotes ever extend farther than Hans? If it does, then this would give doubt that he's heavily relying on Hans's book. When we check to compare them, we see they exist within the same frames. But as we look further into this, we see a few interesting things start to pop up. Remember when I discussed the minor problems in AOI's quotes on surrealism? As said before, the translations, they do match, and AOI's quotes never extend out of Hans's. Now consider these translations to alternate versions. Translations should have small differences, but for these quotes, we have whole sections that are removed. And yet AOI's match exactly with Hans's. Now, there's an argument that these quotes aren't from a Nazi, because the Nazi is quoting other people and AOI is just using those quotes. But all of these quotes are stylized and focused on telling a narrative that Hans wants to fit them, and AOI is doing the same thing. As I said before, these two quotes have missing chunks of them, and Hans's quotation doesn't make it clear to the viewer or the reader that these missing chunks would exist. So it seems that Hans is garbage when it comes to either good citation or quotation habits. That's what caused the earlier issue with AOI citing the incorrect book. All of these alterations highlight that again, AOI is relying on a Nazi's work, as we can see that AOI's quotation matches the same butchered quotes that Hans is using. I am pointing at a lot of small points, but that's because I want to show you all of the evidence for the claims that I'm making. I don't want any of this to seem like a stretch, so that's why I'm highlighting all of these details. Take, for example, another butchered quote that AOI uses.
Picasso's art no longer seeks the complete human being at all, wrote Nikolai Berdyaev. It has lost the faculty of seeing things as wholes. It tears off one cover after another in order to lay bare the structure of nature, and in doing so, penetrates even further into the depths, disclosing images of things truly monstrous.
Now here is that quote from an alternate translation, and here's the translation that Hans uses. The shape and the content of both translations are pretty similar enough that I wouldn't say that Hans had made any real alterations to the original. But as we've seen, AOI doesn't use either of these quotes. He uses this one. It's very similar to the one that Hans uses, but the removal of a few words, Picasso's name is brought up where it shouldn't be, and we see small alterations to the punctuation. It's similar to the one that Hans uses because it's the same one that Hans uses. Later in the book, Hans would use the same quote again, but for whatever reason, decides to alter small parts of it. Another lens we can view all of this from is quality. AOI is relying on Hans's work, and the heavily altered quotes that we've seen before represent big red flags for the quality of Hans's work. And because of, let's say, poor citation from Hans, we've seen mistakes happen on AOI's end. That's not actually the most interesting detail. As I said before, the minor problems weren't exactly caused by what is in the quotes, but how they were being described beforehand. So let's extend the quotes before. What we see here is a very similar match in language. It seems to me the reason he made these mistakes to begin with was because he wasn't relying on the source, but was relying on a Nazi. One interesting idea that popped into my head while checking on quotes was quotation proximity. Quotation proximity aims to see the relative closeness of quotes, with an additional regard to the order AOI uses them in reference to how Hans uses them. When we compare, we don't really get that order link, but we do see that all of them are in pretty close proximity, and a bit of an ordered chain near the end. The entire range is about 60 pages. For reference, the entire book is 300 pages. What stands out to me in regard to quote proximity is again those three quotes that had problems. Mind you, these come from 3 different publications, but in Hans' book they exist in the same chapter and at most a page away from each other. In AOI's video, he uses them in a similar breadth and in similar language. Something then weird happens, and that's in how they wrap up their discussion on surrealism.
When reading this latter statement, one cannot help but remember Nietzsche's warning of the existential disorientation he thought would manifest following the decline of the Christian worldview. Are we not continually falling, backwards, sideways, and in all directions? Do top and bottom still remain? Are we not wandering through infinite nothingness? Is not the breath of empty space in our faces? Has it not grown colder?
Alright, this is his last quote he uses to wrap up his discussion on surrealism. It seems normal, it comes from a popular author and book, but I doubt he simply remembered this warning after reading the quote from Andre Breton. Of course, you may already guess where I'm going with this. Popular author, popular book, but this translation can only be weirdly found from one source. Art in Crisis. The page it comes from is 164. The quote from Andre Breton that he previously just cited comes from page 163. AOI ends his discussion on surrealism with that quote. Hans would end his chapter discussing surrealism with that quote. Simply, I don't think AOI remembered this quote. It's clear that he took it from Hans. Let's get on to the final similar aspect. AOI's first mistake.
In Friedrich's paintings, the setting for this ethos of desolation is nature. His landscapes portray a world grown cold, in which Mother Earth elicits the feelings of dread associated with being alone and homeless in the midst of its vast empty spaces. In 1810, the German poet Heinrich von Kleist described Caspar's painting, The Wreck of Hope, in the following manner: the solitary spark of life in the boundless kingdom of death, the lonely center point in the region of loneliness. This picture with its 2 or 3 mysterious objects opens out before us like the apocalypse itself.
Now, we've already gone over what's wrong with this, but we haven't taken into consideration all of this within the context of Hans. Take, for example, the ethos of desolation. Now, that's an interesting phrase, especially in reference to Friedrich. If we check Art in Crisis, we find the same phrase being used in a chapter labeled The Desolation of Man, with the same chapter discussing, you guessed it, Friedrich. And then the same Heinrich quote, the same one that AOI uses, is only a few sentences away from it. We even see the same description of referring to Friedrich's art to somehow symbolize homelessness in that same chapter. But let's look back at the Heinrich quote again. Right before bringing it up, Hans would for some reason bring up the shipwreck of hope. I've said this before, Hans is bad when it comes to quotes. He'll just bring them up because they sound deep and then never fully elaborate. He in fact will never bring up Heinrich again. So like AOI in many respects. So what happened here is AOI read this quote, saw the shipwreck of hope was brought up prior, and assumed that it was referring to that piece of art. This is a simple mistake that could have been solved, like the rest of them, if AOI just looked at the primary source. But he didn't. Sure, some of the fault can be blamed on Art in Crisis. Well, not really, because most of it's the fault of like poor citation and quotation etiquette. And on the other hand, AOI shouldn't be relying on the work of a Nazi. The language, the translation, the mistakes were caused by AOI using Hans's work. This might be the part where I declare something about this not really being about art, and then follow in the same footsteps as Jacob Geller. But in all honesty, AOI's video just feels lazy. He's not actually interacting with any of these artists. He's reading the negative opinion of a Nazi and then regurgitating them. I'm sure you can give good criticism of any of these art movements, but AOI barely describes what any of these art movements are. So for him to start regurgitating negative opinions of them just feels hollow. One last important thing for you all to consider. AOI uses Hans's language, he uses his phrases, he uses his translations, he uses his ideas. Not once does he ever cite Hans, not a single time. Why is that? I mean, it's clear that he's relying on him, so why not quote him once? Well, one obvious answer. The guy's a Nazi. And well, AOI is smart enough not to quote a Nazi. Hey, this is the end of the video, and as you could guess, this video is weird. This is more so a proof of concept for me. I'm probably going to keep doing this type of stylization, 3D spaces, kind of. This is more so that I just find that it helps keeps things interesting, and allows me to explore concepts in a more unique way. That really isn't possible in a flat medium. My next video is either going to be a follow-up to this video, or a redo of a series of older videos. Otherwise, that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching.